Good evening and welcome. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator at the Frick Collection, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Xavier Salomon. As most of you know, Dr. Salomon is the Frick's Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator and a very energetic and visible presence in this institution. This fall, he's dividing his time between Spanish and Italian projects. Next week marks the opening of his exhibition, Murillo, the Self-Portraits, celebrating the 400th anniversary of the birth of the artist. Tonight, we launch Veronese and Murano, two Venetian Renaissance masterpieces restored, which will remain on view through March 25th, 2018. Veronese and Venice are both home ground for Xavier Salomon, though he's Roman by birth. While an Andrew Mellon pre-doctoral fellow at the Frick in 2004-06, he completed his doctoral dissertation on a Venetian topic for the Courtauld Institute, the patronage of Cardinal Pietro Aldobrandini. It was also at the Frick that he organized the exhibition Veronese's Allegories, Virtue, Love, and Exploration in Renaissance Venice. That auspicious show, which brought together the two Frick masterpieces with the closely related work at the Met, set him on his path of becoming a major figure in the world of Italian Renaissance art. Dr. Salomon moved on from fellow at the Frick to chief curator at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London in 2006. There, he returned to Veronese with an exhibition around the Petrobelli altarpiece, while organizing a diverse roster of shows from Salvador Rosa to Cy Twombly. His connection with the Venetian master continued through his tenure as curator in the Department of European Painting at the Metropolitan Museum from 2011 to 2014. While working on Spanish topics at the Met, he served as well as guest curator for the major exhibition, Veronese Magnificence in Renaissance Italy, held at the National Gallery in London in 2014. Described in The Observer as an exhibition of a lifetime, this extraordinary show brought together 50 of the artist's canvases from around the world. Xavier's authoritative catalog firmly established his reputation as a leading Veronese scholar. While serving as chief curator at the Frick over the past 3 years, Dr. Salomon has traveled frequently to Venice for lectures and as a trustee of Save Venice and a member of the scientific committee of Arte Veneta. Through his Venetian network, he was able to bring to the center of Manhattan two largely hidden masterpieces by Veronese representing St. Jerome and St. Agatha from a church on the island of Murano, works that rarely travel. Now beautifully restored through the generosity of Venetian heritage and Bulgari, the paintings hang in the room next door. In the accompanying catalog, Xavier's meticulous research brings to light the fascinating history of the works, along with essays on the restoration by Michael Clemente and Claudia Vittori. Dr. Salomon contributes regularly to the Burlington Magazine, Apollo, and other prestigious journals. He's at work on the catalogs of many future exhibitions, as well as his own catalog raisonné on Veronese's drawings. This year saw the publication of his book on Holbein's Sir Thomas More, with an introduction by Hilary Mantel, the first book in our new diptych series. Please give a very warm welcome to the Frick's own Renaissance man and our very dear friend, Xavier Salomon.
Thank you, Susan, for that very generous introduction. I will try and live up to that. In the autumn of 1921, a partnership began on the island of Murano, in the Venetian Lagoon. The 34-year-old Venetian antique dealer, Giacomo Cappellin, you see him here, entered a business enterprise with the 26-year-old Milanese lawyer, Paolo Veronese. There. The two men founded that year a glass furnace on the island, which was named Vetri Soffiati Muranesi, Cappellin, Venini and Company. To direct the artistic production of the enterprise, they called a well-established artist from Murano, Vittorio Zecchin. You see him here. Zecchin was born on the island of Murano and had trained as an artist at the Accademia in Venice, and had become well known for his large Art Nouveau canvases and wall paintings, which were heavily influenced by Viennese art from the time and by Klimt in particular. Zecchin, however, looked also at quintessentially Venetian models, such as medieval mosaics and early Renaissance art. Zecchin's artistic production was not limited to painting. Over the years, he became interested in the relationship between the so-called fine arts and the decorative arts, and he began to design embroideries, tapestries, decorated glass. Cappellin and Venini therefore asked Zecchin to work for them and to design glass objects. Over the next 4 years, Zecchin, Cappellin, and Venini produced some of the simplest, most beautiful, and elegant forms that were ever to be produced in Murano. The island's artistic links to glass date back to at least the 10th century, and by the late 19th century, Murano glass was known for its precious designs, still entrenched in a long-faded 18th century dream. Zecchin broke away from the Murano tradition and returned to simpler forms, looking at earlier, mainly Renaissance, models. The art critic Roberto Papini wrote in 1923, Vittorio Zecchin, one of the most exquisite artists Italy has today, has the merit to have understood first, again, that glass from his Murano has two essential qualities, lightness and limpidity. The more evident and joyous, the more they are contained in forms of simple elegance and harmony. The business founded by Cappellin and Venini flourished for the next 4 years, but at the end of 1925, Cappellin and Venini parted ways. Cappellin founded his own Maestri Vetrai Muranesi, Cappellin and Company, with Zecchin still as its director for a year and a half, before he was replaced by the young architect Carlo Scarpa. Venini instead called the sculptor Napoleone Martinuzzi to direct the Vetri Soffiati Muranesi, Venini and Company. Zecchini's designs, however, continued to be used by both glass furnaces for many years to come. And the most celebrated and well-known design by Zecchin for Cappellin and Venini was the so-called Veronese vase, which became the symbol of new glass production and was used to represent the quintessential Cappellin and Venini glass vase. So here you see the Cappellin and Venini's shop with the symbol up here of the Veronese vase, and here's the Veronese vase. The shape of this vase was hugely popular, and it is still manufactured in Murano. Zecchin often took inspiration for his designs from glass from Renaissance artists, such as, for example, Hans Holbein and Jacopo Tintoretto. The name of the Veronese vase derived, in fact, from the painter Paolo Cagliari. Born in Verona in 1528, he moved to Venice in the early 1550s and was based and worked in the city for almost 40 years, until his death in 1588. Because of his birthplace, he was known as Paolo Veronese throughout his life. The name of the vase was directly linked to the painter. Zecchin copied the design from a glass vase which appears in Veronese's Annunciation in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice. This monumental canvas was painted in the mid-1570s for the Sala dell'Albergo of the Scuola dei Mercanti in Venice. To the right of the composition, here, next to the Annunciate Virgin, appears the glass vase with roses in it. Zecchin used the design in Veronese's painting to return to the simpler forms of Renaissance glass. And the name of the vase has over the last century directly and inextricably linked the names of Paolo Veronese with that of glass produced on the island of Murano. Veronese was already admired during his lifetime for the grandiose scenes of magnificent banquets. One of his first biographers, Marco Boschini, wrote in 1674 that, I quote, "The supreme gods allowed him, Veronese, to insert their portraits in his works, and because of this every figure by Paolo has something celestial. Architecture put into his hands the most well-conceived and proportioned outlines, which I wish someone would use in the most decorous buildings. Invention has made him its arbiter in placing and ordering groups and narratives, decorating them with the most weighty forms and expressions of character, so sumptuously dressed that they might serve as model and instructions for princes, and how they should appear majestic in front of the world. In conclusion, all the graces had the ambition of always assisting him, so that he can be called the delight of the world, because in him there is everything that one would look for in pictorial art and in universal taste. A few years earlier, Boschini had also stated, with regards to Veronese's art, I quote again, that certainly never has been seen among painters such regal pomp and circumstance, such majestic actions, such weighty and decorous manner. He is the treasurer of art and of colors. This is not painting, it is magic that casts a spell on people who see it. Many of Veronese's paintings, such as the marriage feast at Cana, which you see here, painted in the 1570s for the Cucina Palace on the Grand Canal, and now in Dresden, show sumptuous banquets with guests dressed in luxurious outfits. The tables are usually richly decorated, and next to silver and metalwork, many glass objects produced in Murano are often portrayed, and in this case, a number of Murano glasses appear in the hands of guests and on the table. Here, and again down here and below. The island of Murano was already famous during Veronese's lifetime for its production of glass. Murano lies half a mile northeast of Venice, in the lagoon between the city and the mainland. And so the smaller map shows the mainland, Venice, Murano, the Lido down here, and then obviously the open sea below. Although the island and its population was always linked and loosely dependent on Venice, Murano functioned independently for most of its history, and after 1272 it was governed by a magistrate known as the Podestà. The island, or better the group of islands, is surprisingly similar in plan to Venice, and is in many ways a miniature version of Venice itself. So the same way that Venice is cut across by the Grand Canal, so you have the canal here of Santo Stefano. And these are places, Santa Maria degli Angeli, San Pietro Martire, Santo Stefano, and Palazzo Trevisan, that we'll go back to in a second. And here you see Murano in a detail of the famous 1500 map of Jacopo de Barberi, where you see this is Santa Maria degli Angeli again, San Pietro here, Santo Stefano across, Palazzo Trevisan somewhere there. Like Venice, Murano is bisected by the main canal that cuts it almost in half. This is named the Canale di Santo Stefano, after one of the island's principal churches, which was demolished between 1813 and 1835. The island was, and still is, an extraordinary place. Most of the land is occupied by glass furnaces, producing the objects that made the island famous throughout the centuries. Murano remains to this day one of the preeminent locations for glass production worldwide in the early modern era. Especially after the 15th century, however, many patrician families built retreats and gardens and palaces in Murano, where they could delight in their time away from the city. The combination of glass-making furnaces and aristocratic dwelling made Murano an island of deep and very interesting contrasts. Soon after Veronese moved to Venice, he received his first, and arguably his most important, commission for Murano. On the island, Veronese decorated 2 rooms in the magnificent palace which had recently been built for the aristocrat Camillo Trevisan. Trevisan was connected to the intellectual circles of Venice, and in the mid-1550s had built a substantial residence on Murano. The facade overlooked one of the principal canals of the island, while at the back, a magnificent garden connected the building to the outer lagoon. To decorate this sumptuous palace, Trevisan called a group of painters. Prospero Bresciano and Battista del Moro were probably commissioned to fresco the front and back facades of the building, but unfortunately no trace of their decoration survives today. Bernardino India frescoed a room on the ground floor of the palace, Battista Zelotti another, and Veronese frescoed 2 rooms, one on the ground floor and one on the piano nobile. After the palace was used as barracks in 1848 to 49, it has effectively been abandoned ever since and remains in desperate conditions today. Already in 1890, Giuseppe Marino Urbani de Geltov, who wrote the first and only published monograph on the palace, lamented the state of the building was in at the time. Today the situation is heartbreaking. The building in the interior survives in its original shape, but starting from the entrance and continuing through its rooms, it is in a disastrous state of absolute neglect. Many of the decorations of the palace, including sculptures and reliefs by Alessandro Vittoria, remain in the spaces for which they were created, but almost invariably in fragmentary state. The beautiful grounds of the palace were transformed in industrial spaces for the production and storage of glass, and also remain entirely abandoned. The full surface of the garden, from the lagoon to the back facade of the palace, is occupied today by this industrial relic. What you see here is the back facade, which was originally U-shaped, so this glass part here has been put in to fill in the courtyard inside, and all of this is over the gardens, the fountains that were on the back to the lagoon. And here we're obviously on the, we're between the ground floor and the first floor, first and second floor of the palace. The full surface of the garden of the palace is occupied by this industrial relic. It was for this palace that Veronese painted two of his most important early fresco cycles. In a central room on the first floor, the Piano Nobile, which Vasari in his biography of Veronese described as a loggia, the painter decorated the walls with landscapes inset in architectural elements. And here's a fragment of those. While on the ceiling, he painted a number of gods and goddesses: Venus, Jupiter, Janus, Saturn, Juno, Neptune, Bacchus, and Apollo, and Cybele. And here you see details of what remains of Jupiter on the left and Cybele on the right. In the two apses, one in front of the other in the room, Veronese painted two couples of Cupids, Eros and Anteros, fighting. On the ground floor of the palace were two large rooms towards the garden. And here's a plan of the palace. This is the Canal in Murano, the fondamenta. This is the entrance I showed you before, with the open courtyard. This is where the Vittoria sculptures are. This is the so-called loggia, which on the upper floor has the frescoes by Veronese. And we're now talking about these two rooms here, 1 and 2, which if you look at the palace, you have to imagine on the floor below, they have the two windows. This is one room, that's the other room, immediately identical, but on the ground floor. The one on the left had, which is on the right here, had mythological subjects by Battista Zelotti, while the one on the right had frescoes by Veronese, which depicted the planetary gods and goddesses. Fortunately, a series of elements from this room was removed at the end of the 19th century. Veronese's frescoes for the ceiling of the room were detached between 1866 and 1890 and are now at the Louvre in Paris. Originally, the two fragments were a single ceiling, which was divided in two sections when the fresco was detached. So this is more or less what the ceiling looked like originally. The fireplace from the same room also still survives, and I found it a few years ago at Vizcaya, a house near Miami in Florida, and published it in an article in 2015. Here's the fireplace at Vizcaya, and this is a photo of the fireplace at Murano in 1890 and the fireplace as it is now. The large crack has been restored, but it's still visible there, and the top part is now missing. We don't know what's happened to that. But the sides of this in Murano were frescoed by Veronese with two satyrs, and of course those are gone and don't exist anymore. But fortunately the fireplace survives. Palazzo Trevisan in Murano must have been a spectacular sight by the early 1560s, and Veronese produced some of his most important early works for this palace for Camillo Trevisan. And of course, needless to say, it remained an important example for what happens later in the Villa Barbaro at Maser. The commission, which is at the heart of the exhibition Veronese in Murano, two Venetian Renaissance masterpieces restored, is still shrouded in mystery. In June 1187, a noble woman called Ginevra Gradenigo donated family land on the northwestern edge of the Canale di Santo Stefano in Murano to a group of Augustinian nuns, and on that site established the church and nunnery of Santa Maria degli Angeli. In the later Middle Ages, the church, with its adjacent monastery, quickly became one of the most important in Murano. In the late 15th century, the church was rebuilt and substantially enlarged, and the new church of Santa Maria degli Angeli was consecrated in May 1529. And here you see it down the canal. Here's the huge church. Its importance is attested to by the burial there in front of the high altar in 1578 of Doge Sebastiano Venier, one of the victorious leaders of the Christian navy against the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, art patronage at Santa Maria degli Angeli thrived, and paintings by Pordenone, like the high altar with the Annunciation, and by Giuseppe Porta Salviati, Pietro Damini, Niccolò Rondinelli, as well as sculptures by Orazio and Angelo Marinali, were created for the Augustinian nuns. Santa Maria degli Angeli was also known for other reasons. Many girls from the most prominent aristocratic families in Venice became nuns at Santa Maria degli Angeli, most commonly for dynastic reasons rather than for true vocation. In the 18th century, the nunnery was celebrated for the beauty and availability of its nuns. One of Giacomo Casanova's girlfriends, for example, was sent by her family to Santa Maria degli Angeli. And the famous libertine had also a celebrated affair with another noble nun at Santa Maria degli Angeli, whom he referred to in his memoirs as M.M. It is amusing to consider that the two paintings by Veronese, today here at the Frick collection on loan from Murano, would have been silent witnesses to Casanova and M.M.'s affair at Santa Maria degli Angeli in the 18th century. It was next to this significant church that a small chapel was built in the mid-16th century, and it was there that a series of 5 paintings by Paolo Veronese were preserved. Little is known about Francesco degli Arbori, the priest of Santo Stefano, who served as the chaplain of the nuns of Santa Maria degli Angeli in the 16th century, though 2 documents, which I discovered in conjunction with research for this exhibition, shed some light on him. A deed of gift, signed on November 10, 1566, from him to the nuns at Santa Maria degli Angeli, provides some information on the commission. In the document, the priest, who defines himself as chaplain of the nuns, cappellano al presente delle reverende madri monache degli Anzoli, states that the nuns gave him permission to use, free of charge, a plot of land within their cemetery, adjoining the church. There, for his own personal devotion, per mia devozione, he intended to build a chapel dedicated to St. Jerome. The 1566 deed transferred ownership of the planned chapel and everything in it to the nuns, offering the gift made with my own labor, fatto delle mie fatiche e non d'altri, in honor of God, the Virgin Mary, and Saints Jerome and Nicholas. Degli Arbori stipulated that his family was to have no jurisdiction whatsoever over the chapel, and also promised that during his lifetime, the monastery would not be responsible for any of the chapel's expenses. He asked that no one be buried in the chapel, and expressed his wish that the nuns would allow him to be buried near the chapel in the cemetery, nel suo cimiterio appresso la suddetta cappella. The nuns' confessor, Domenico Surian, and their farmer, Juan Michel Beffa, acted as witnesses to the signing of the deed. The plot of land where Degli Arbori's chapel was built, presumably between the end of 1566 and 1567, is to the side of the church and is visible in a number of maps of Santa Maria degli Angeli. This map shows the monastery in September 1569, with the monastery building, church, and the small chapel. So this is the canal with various buildings. Here's the monastery complex. That's the refectory. That's the chapter house. Various storage facilities along the water. That's the chiesa, the church. And then next to it, there's the cemetery with the little chapel freestanding to the side of it. The church was, and still is, surrounded by land on 2 sides, so in front and to the side. And this area served as a public square in front of the building and also as a cemetery for the nuns to the side. To the left of the church was the large area occupied by the nuns' monastery. The interior of the church was divided into 2 main areas, one used for the nuns' choir towards the facade, and one for public worship closer to the high altar. Because of this, the public entrance to the church was not from the main facade, as one would expect, but instead from the middle of the right wall of the building. And you can see here the church, and the entrance is from the side, not from the facade. So this lower part was the nuns' choir, the upper part was the public choir. So in effect, the chapel was directly across from the main entrance of the church. Across, more or less from the right transept of the church, was degli Arbori's freestanding chapel, a small structure within the cemetery. By November 1566, the construction of the chapel and its decoration must have been underway. An inscription on the facade of the chapel, on the side of the door, recorded its patron and its foundation on October 6, 1566. Another inscription on the opposite side of the door documented the date of its consecration by Giovanni Dolfin, the Bishop of Torcello, on February 5, 1568. And this is nothing to do with the chapel. It's a different small chapel in Murano, but it's just to give you an idea of what the chapel probably looked like. It would have been a small brick structure with a single door, something around, maybe a little bit larger than this, but similar to this. The chapel was demolished, as we will see, in 1830, but the site on which it once stood, near Santa Maria degli Angeli, still survives untouched. And you have to imagine the chapel more or less where that clump of trees is, so it must have been somewhere here. No evidence of the architectural structure of degli Arbori's chapel survives, but Abbot Vincenzo Zanetti, in his book on Santa Maria degli Angeli of 1863, describes the structure in some detail. Born in 1824, Zanetti would have been too young to remember the chapel. He must have consulted sources and talked to people who recalled it. According to Zanetti, the facade of the chapel had a single door, over which was an inscription with a dedication to Saint Jerome, Sacrum Divi Hieronimi. While researching for this exhibition in Murano, I found that a small stone door surmounted by a triangular pediment supported by two corbels that now leads from the exterior right wall of Santa Maria degli Angeli to an interior staircase, close to the site where the main door of the church once stood, bears the inscription reported by Zanetti. And you can't see it, but it's here. It just says Sacrum Divi Hieronimi. When the chapel was demolished, the door must have been preserved and repurposed. Saved in 1830 and reused, the door is still evidently the only architectural relic of degli Arbori's chapel. And I'm still uncertain if the crucifix went with the door and was part of the same structure, or if it's a later addition that came from somewhere else and was attached to the door after 1830. I mean, we don't know. There is no description of the crucifix in any of the descriptions of the chapel for the facade. On March 6, 1579, degli Arbori signed his will, which he had written in his room in an attic near the church of Santo Stefano. He started with instructions for his funeral, stipulating that 8 masses be celebrated for his soul in his chapel, dedicated to St. Jerome, and that he be buried just outside the door of the building, nella mia arca che è per mezzo della porta della chiesola predetta. His body was to be brought to the chapel in a simple manner, without pomp, with his coffin covered by a rug and accompanied by only 2 tapers. And I'm showing you the little chapel again to give you a sense of what it may have looked like. The candles were to be paid for by the chapter of Santo Stefano, not by the nuns of Santa Maria degli Angeli. And degli Arbori asked that his body be accompanied in procession to the chapel by the chapter of Santo Stefano, by the nuns confessor and others associated with Santa Maria degli Angeli. He left money for them all, including 1 ducat each for the undertakers who were to bury him. He listed gifts to various family members and friends. To his nephew Ludovico, a friar in the Order of the Carità, he left his breviary. And to Ludovico and another nephew, Niccolò, who was a priest at San Silvestro, went all of his books, which he said were worth not much. Money was left to both of his nephews and to other children of his brother Piero and his sister Monica, including his niece Marina, who had married the notary Suanne Crielli. He also left 25 ducats for the dowry of one of his nieces, the daughter of his deceased brother Piero, whose name I do not remember, della quale ora non mi ricordo il nome. I'm sure the niece was very happy about this. Money, 100 ducats, was also left to the priests of Santo Stefano, with the stipulation that every year, on the Sunday after Easter, for all eternity, they celebrate a Mass for his soul in his chapel. Degli Arbori had 575 ducats invested in bonds, which he left to the nuns of Santa Maria degli Angeli, with the condition that 2 of them, Giustina Morosini and Eufrasia Tiepolo, invest the funds for the maintenance of his chapel. The nuns had to promise that every year, for all eternity, Masses would be celebrated on the feast days of St. Jerome, September 30th, St. Nicholas, December 6th, and St. Agatha, February 5th. With the remaining money from the investments, candles and oil for lamps in the chapel were to be acquired, and money would also have to be spent on dowries for young girls and charity for poor old men. Degli Arbori also asked that both nuns nominate other nuns to replace them when they died, so that 2 nuns of the monastery would always oversee the chapel and its funds and foundation. The priest nominated his niece, Adriana, wife of Giacomo Gardello, who during his lifetime he claimed had been particularly close to him, as his universal heir. A few months later, on September 7, 1579, Francesco degli Arbori died. As he had wished, he was buried outside his chapel, under an inscribed stone slab. His legacy to Santa Maria degli Angeli, however, was contested, and Francesco's nephews and nieces, Nicolò, Marina, and Adriana, and I suspect also the one whose name he didn't remember, sued Giustina Morosini and Eufrasia Tiepolo, the 2 nuns in charge of their uncle's bequest to Santa Maria degli Angeli, especially over the dowry of their mother, Monica, Francesco's sister. The lawsuit continued for years, but the nuns seemed to have come out of it winning. Francesco degli Arbori's chapel was no doubt a modest space, with no large inscriptions in its interior and a single altar facing the main door. Degli Arbori was not rich, but he was devoted to his chapel and must have spent a substantial amount of money out of his income to build and decorate the chapel. For the paintings inside the chapel, he chose Paolo Veronese. In the mid-1560s, Veronese was at the height of his career in Venice, working for the state, for aristocratic families, religious institutions in the city, and for prominent patrons abroad. In about 1565, he was in the midst of some of the most monumental paintings of his career. In 1562-63, he had just painted the massive marriage feast at Cana for the refectory of San Giorgio Maggiore. This is a copy, and the original is now in the Louvre in Paris. He was at work on the great altarpiece of the Martyrdom of St. George for San Giorgio in Braida in Verona, the 2 large lateral paintings in the apse of San Sebastiano in Venice. Here's the St. Sebastian exhorting Mark and Marcellinus to their martyrdom, and across from it, the same size, there is a martyrdom of St. Sebastian. And also, of course, the family of Darius before Alexander for Francesco Pisani's palace at Montagnana, which is now in the National Gallery in London. In these same years, he was painting these 2 large allegorical canvases, the choice between virtue and vice and wisdom and strength, that were on the market and probably reached Vienna by 1567, and are now here, of course, in the Frick collection. These works are among Veronese's greatest and most spectacular masterpieces. How degli Arbori got to know such a prominent and highly prized painter, and his reason for choosing him to decorate his chapel, remain unknown. Degli Arbori may have known Veronese's frescoes for the Trevisan Palace in Murano, which were painted just 10 years before. But unfortunately, not knowing more about Degli Arbori's biography makes it very difficult to fully understand his links with Veronese and the specific reasons for commissioning the paintings and the chapel. A project similar to Degli Arbori's chapel was another small chapel, dedicated in this case to St. John the Baptist, which was built in the early 1560s by Giovanni Stravanzino and his father Bartolomeo, next to the Church of the Cappuccini on the island of the Giudecca. Dedicated in 1561, the freestanding chapel was decorated with a single small altarpiece by Veronese, the Baptism of Christ, which included portraits of both patrons, and here's Bartolomeo and Giovanni Stravanzino in the bottom corner. When it was demolished later in the 16th century to make space for the building of Palladio's Church of Il Redentore, the small altarpiece was saved and displayed in the sacristy of the new church. The Stravanzino chapel may have provided one of the models for degli Arbori's creation of his own chapel of St. Jerome. In both his deed of donation and in his will, degli Arbori writes about his special devotion to St. Jerome. In the 2 documents, he also lists St. Nicholas and in his will, St. Agatha. It is understandable that Giovanni Stravanzino would dedicate his chapel to St. John the Baptist, his name saint, and commission from Veronese an altarpiece depicting one of the key episodes in the saint's life, the baptism of Christ. Why, however, Francesco degli Arbori was so devoted to St. Jerome, and then to St. Nicholas and Agatha, is unclear. While his nephew was called Nicolò, possibly referring to a family preference for that name and saint, No one in the degli Arbori family appears to have been called Girolamo or Agatha. We know nothing of the identity and names of Francesco's parents, and I wonder perhaps if they were called Girolamo and Agatha. It would have made more sense for degli Arbori to dedicate his chapel to his named saint, St. Francis of Assisi, but maybe that would have been inappropriate, away from a Franciscan institution. Santa Maria degli Angeli was, after all, under Augustinian rule. More likely, the three saints were particularly venerated by degli Arbori for personal reasons, but with so little biographical information, it is difficult to say what those reasons may have been. The first reference to the paintings by Veronese in degli Arbori's chapel at Santa Maria degli Angeli is in Carlo Ridolfi's biography of the artist of 1648. In it, he writes, "And in a small chapel near the Angeli, there is a St. Jerome in meditation, and above the door, St. Agatha, visited in prison by St. Peter, and an angel precedes him with a torch. Over the altar was the St. Jerome in the wilderness, and on the opposite wall, over the door of the chapel, the St. Agatha visited in prison by St. Peter." According to later sources, there were three other small paintings by Veronese in the chapel, a Pietà, a St. Nicholas, and a St. John the Baptist, and these were placed together under the St. Jerome, possibly functioning as some form of predella, with the Pietà at its center. By 1566, when Veronese created the St. Jerome in the wilderness for degli Arbori's chapel, he had already painted the saint on at least 4 occasions. Jerome appears in a number of altarpieces from the 1560s and from the artist's subsequent career, as well as in later, smaller devotional paintings, adapting the saint's appearance according to the type of commission and the specific wishes of each patron. St. Jerome lived between the 4th and 5th centuries in Dalmatia. In the 16th century, most of what was known about him derived from Jacobus da Voragine's 13th century golden legend. A scholar and student of the Holy Scriptures, Jerome knew Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, and was celebrated for his translation of the Bible into Latin, the so-called Vulgata. Even though, historically, Jerome was never made a cardinal, Jacobus de Voragine recounts that at the age of 29, Jerome was ordained a cardinal priest in the Church of Rome. As one of the 4 doctors of the Western Church, together with Ambrose, Augustine, and Gregory, Jerome was often portrayed wearing cardinal's robes. He was said to have spent 4 years in Syria, where he led an ascetic life in the desert. In a letter cited by Voragine, Jerome described his trials in the desert to his friend Eustochium. I quote, "Living in the wilderness, in the vast solitude that provides a horrid, sun-scorched abode to monks, my misshapen limbs shuddered in their sackcloth, my squalid skin had taken the blackness of an Ethiopian's flesh. Tears all day, groans all day, and if, resisted as I might, sleep overwhelmed me, my fleshless bones, hardly holding together, scraped against the bare ground. I say nothing about food or drink. All the company I had was scorpions and wild beasts. So it was that I wept continually and starved the rebellious flesh for weeks at a time. Often I joined day to night and did not stop beating my breast until the Lord restored my peace of mind. Angry and stern with myself, I plunged alone, deeper and deeper into the wasteland. And, as the Lord is my witness, from time to time, and after many tears, I seemed to be in the midst of throngs of angels." After the time in the desert, Jerome embarked on his translation of the Bible, which occupied him for the next 55 years. As a monk in a monastery in Bethlehem, he was visited by what was to become one of his most frequent iconographic symbols. According still to Voragine, Jerome and other monks were reading the scriptures in the monastery when a lion limped into the space. The monks began to flee in terror, but Jerome realized that the animal's paw was injured by thorns and asked them to help him dress the wounds on the lion's paw. Once healed, the lion lost all his wildness and lived among the monks like a house pet. In Western iconography, Jerome appears either as the scholarly saint, dressed in his cardinal robes and at work on his translation of the Bible, or as the ascetic saint in the desert. And in both instances, he is invariably accompanied by the faithful lion. The setting in Francesco degli Arbori's canvas is the Syrian Desert, looking rather like the Venetian foothill of the Alps. I think we're near Treviso, Asolo, rather than Syria. On the right, a large rocky outcrop vertically cuts the composition in two. Trees frame it on both sides. To the left, the landscape opens up towards the horizon and the glow of an emerging dawn or maybe a setting sun. The sky is punctuated by clouds and an intense orange and pink haze. Also on the right, a rustic hut made of wooden beams held together by ropes provides Jerome with shelter from the elements. And underneath it is a still life of the objects traditionally associated with Jerome. A crucifix, an hourglass, a skull, and two open books. One is here and one is barely visible behind the crucifix. Jerome is an isolated figure in the landscape, the only human inhabiting the site, alone in his grueling devotion. His body is tense and muscular, covered only by red drapery held together with a cord. His features are firmly fixed on the crucifix, while in his right hand he holds the rock with which he has been beating his chest. His bruised ribs are visible and drops of blood attest to his self-punishment. The saint's face is transfixed, an exercise in intensity. He is toothless and haggard, and tears pour from his eyes. Wind rustles his graying beard in an extraordinary passage of bravura painting. The only witness to Jerome's ascetic life is the lion. Even though the episode with the lion supposedly postdated Jerome's years in the desert, the animal is included as an attribute of the saint. The red robe and cardinal's hat, barely visible behind the crucifix to the right, and believe me, they're up there somewhere, refer to Jerome's supposed cardinalate. Once framed, presumably in an architectural stone surround over the altar of degli Arbori's chapel, this would have been a forceful and severe image. The small, simple chapel may have even recalled Jerome's cave in the desert in its claustrophobic dimension, and the impact of the sacred image on the faithful must have been particularly powerful when entering the church. The iconographic tradition of Jerome in the desert, with his skull and lion, dates to the Middle Ages. In Venice, Veronese is likely to have looked at both earlier and contemporary models. Giovanni Bellini painted the subject of St. Jerome in the wilderness on a number of occasions. In a large panel from about 1480, Bellini included all the elements present in Veronese's painting: the crucifix, the books, the lion. But the saint appears absorbed in his scholarly pursuits, rather than undergoing the emotional experience that Veronese portrays. The intensity captured by Veronese was altogether new in Venetian art for this subject matter. All the late 15th and early 16th century depictions of Jerome in Venice focused on the erudite nature of the saint, who was shown in lyrical landscapes. Veronese's Jerome was the first with a theatrical concentration on suffering, and it reverberated through Venetian art. All of Titian's, Jacopo Tintoretto's, and Jacopo Bassano's similar depictions of the saint actually date from at least the late 1560s, or more typically from the 1570s, and seem to all derive in some way from the example of Veronese's painting for Murano. In his depiction of St. Jerome, Veronese may have also been indebted to sculptural models. Alessandro Vittoria was at work in 1566 on a marble statue of the saint for the Zane altar in the Frari in Venice, which seems to be related to the disheveled Jerome in Murano. The physical typology of Vittoria's Jerome is particularly close to Veronese's, and the relationship between the sculptor and the painter was, as we know, a very close one. However, while the painter and sculptor were definitely at work on their respective representations of the penitent Jerome in 1566 to 67, Vittoria did not complete his sculpture until much later, well into the 1570s. Therefore, it seems likely that the painting and sculpture in some way informed each other as they were being created. And throughout the 1570s, harsh and penetrating images of St. Jerome started to populate many of the altars of Venice. The iconography of St. Jerome and the Venetian tradition of depicting the doctor of the church in altarpieces and devotional paintings was very well established. But the second saint degli Arbori wanted painted in his chapel was a very unusual choice. As early sources report, St Agatha Visited in prison by St Peter was on the counter facade of degli Arbori's chapel, high above the door. According to Jacobus da Voragine again in the Golden Legend, St Agatha was a 3rd century martyr from Sicily who lived at the time of the Christian persecution under Emperor Decius. Born in Catania, she has long been considered the patron saint of the city, and her cult was particularly well established in Sicily. A wealthy Christian of noble origin, Agatha was summoned by Quintianus, the consular office in Sicily, who was enticed by the Virgin's beauty. He first tried to bend her to his will by placing her for a month in a brothel of a woman named Aphrodisia. Firm in her belief, Agatha left the house untouched. Quintianus then ordered Agatha to worship pagan idols. When she refused, he sent her to jail, where she was tortured. Quintianus ordered the executioners to twist her breasts for a long time and then cut them off. Left in prison with no treatment for her wounds and no food or water, she was visited in the middle of the night by an old man who was preceded by a boy carrying a light. The man revealed himself as St. Peter and said he had been sent by God to heal her. With the jailers surprised by the supernatural light, Peter the Apostle vanished. Agatha knelt in thanksgiving and found that all the hurts were healed and her breast restored to her bosom. Quintianus, however, did not desist. He tried to place Agatha over burning coals, but she was saved by a heaven-sent earthquake. Finally, after having been sent back to jail and praying God for relief from these tortures, she peacefully died in prison. The reason for degli Arbori's devotion to St. Agatha, as we have seen, is unknown. No church in Venice or Murano was ever dedicated to her. In Venice, the subject of her martyrdom was rarely depicted, and that of St. Peter visiting her in prison even less so. Degli Arbori's brother was called Piero, and this may explain why, out of all the episodes from the life of St. Agatha, the priest may have chosen this specific one. Veronese seems to be the first in Venice to treat the subject of St. Peter visiting Agatha in prison. The scene is set inside the saint's bare prison cell. A high grilled window and a door to the right are the only connections to the outside world. According to the Golden Legend, the scene took place at night, but Veronese's window, up here, though half closed by a shutter that partly obscures the light, seems to be open onto a clear, sunny day. Below the window is the prisoner's wooden bed, covered by a simple mattress, down here, and underneath it is a chamber pot. A candle is lit to the left, and next to it, on top of a wooden shelf, Veronese painted a modest but exquisite still life, a glass bottle with red wine, a bowl, and a loaf of bread, up here. The painter disregarded the passage by Voragine in which he says quite clearly that Quintianus ordered that Agatha be denied food or drink. But of course the presence of bread and wine certainly has a Eucharistic meaning of some kind. Attached to the wall on the left are a framed object to the side here, a rosary and a crucifix. They're all here. The area with the frame is particularly worn, but the object in it was probably a devotional print. A book is on the nearby bench on which Agatha leans, down here. The saint has been interrupted during her prayers in the darkness of the prison. She rests a hand on the bench, which is covered by a heavy pink and green drapery. A metal chain below the bench makes clear that she's a prisoner. With her other hand, she brings a piece of white drapery to her wounded breasts. The fabric reveals the wounds inflicted by the executioners, and the white sheet is spotted with blood stains. Two visitors are bursting into the cell. The first, a beautiful blonde angel dressed in light blue, holds a long taper that brings light into the shadowy room. He precedes Peter, who towers over the right part of the picture. Dressed in blue and orange, he stands by the open door, holding in his left hand the keys to heaven, 1 gold, 1 silver, and his standard attribute. With his right hand he gestures to heaven, probably referring both to his celestial mission and to Agatha's imminent healing, and possibly also to her future death. As much as the St. Jerome in the wilderness is an airy and windswept scene, the St. Agatha Visited in prison by St. Peter is claustrophobic and stifling. 2 years after Veronese painted the St. Agatha scene, Giovanni Battista Fontana produced an etching after it, which is signed and dated 1569. The print follows the composition of the painting faithfully. Accompanied by a series of inscriptions, the etching is signed by Fontana after Paolo Veronese's composition, and was published in Venice by Niccolò Nelli in 1569, where it is described as a new design. The image after Veronese's canvas is also accompanied by a poem describing the event represented in the painting. The print was produced while Francesco degli Arbori was still alive, as it is the only one of the 5 paintings in the priest's private chapel to be engraved during the patron's and the painter's lives. Both degli Arbori and Veronese seem to have been particularly keen on this painting. When first described by Ridolfi in 1648, together with the St. Jerome in the wilderness, the St. Agatha was also mentioned as a work by Veronese. But in 1664, however, Marco Boschini attributed the canvas to Veronese's brother, Benedetto Cagliari, although he wrote, "It is so beautiful as if it had been painted by Paolo himself." Benedetto, 10 years younger than Paolo, collaborated with his older brother from the mid-1550s at least. By 1566, they would have been working together. But at the same time, Benedetto also had an independent career. What prompted Boschini to change the attribution of the painting and give it to Benedetto is unclear. A number of writers throughout the 17th century and well into the 20th century persisted in attributing the painting to Benedetto. Anton Maria Zanetti in 1771 agreed with Boschini on an attribution by Benedetto, but he said, "The heads in this painting are so beautiful and painted with such grace and skill. Because of this, many people thought the painting was the work by Paolo himself and not by Benedetto, and as such it was engraved in copper. Here is how the imitator, as he rises somewhat, is defrauded of his deserved praise." Many were puzzled by the canvas's quality. Zanetti, revising Boschini's book in 1733, said that it was such a beautiful painting by Benedetto Cagliari, especially the head of the St. Peter, looks like it could be by Paolo, and it is possible to believe that some of the last brushstrokes were actually by him. While scholars have found the attribution to Paolo dubious, others suggested that it was painted by Paolo but with Benedetto's help. Many historians, nonetheless, remain faithful to the attribution to Paolo. So the attribution has fluctuated, therefore, over the years, not only between Paolo and Benedetto, but also between Benedetto serving as Paolo's assistant or Paolo finishing parts of Benedetto's painting. And when this painting was exhibited only a few months ago in Venice, it was attributed to Benedetto. In 1807, Moschini defended Paolo's authorship of the painting. For him, another proof lay in the letters inscribed at the bottom. Between the feet of the angel and St. Peter, DPV. Moschini interpreted these as meaning di Paolo Veronese, by Paolo Veronese, or dipinse Paolo Veronese, painted by Paolo Veronese. A few years later, in 1815, he commented, however, on how unusual this signature was in Veronese's work. In fact, the DPV is a much later inscription that has nothing to do with Veronese's authorship. The letters stand for Demanio Province Venete, the designation that after the fall of the Venetian Republic under Napoleon in 1797 marked paintings whose ownership was transferred from religious institutions to the newly created state of the Province Venete. All the early sources on the painting up to Boschini in 1664, almost 100 years after the painting was created, give the painting to Paolo. As such, the attribution appears in Fontana's print that we've seen earlier. It is very unlikely that only 2 years after the canvas was painted, a printmaker would have mistaken Paolo for Benedetto in a published print. The composition of the painting, with its extraordinary still life elements, with a simplicity worthy of Zurbarán, Giorgio Morandi, and its bold compositional choices, is certainly not by Benedetto. The central angel with its diagonally placed taper, the candle overlapping its face, and the window above is an astonishing invention worthy of Paolo. The heads of the 3 figures are sensitively painted and stylistically close to Paolo's work from the 1560s. The weakest part of the St. Agatha Visited in prison by St. Peter are the 2 main saints' draperies, the highlights of which are not as refined as in other Veronese paintings from the period. it is possible that Benedetto or another workshop assistant was left in charge of these areas, especially considering that the painting was destined to hang high up above a door in a small private chapel in a cemetery in Murano. It is also worth considering that some of the awkwardness in the composition of the figures in the painting is connected to the fact that the painting was designed to be seen above a door from well below. So all of the lower part of the legs are very odd when you look at them, but if you imagine them up high above you, they actually make sense. And however, the weak areas are also the parts in the painting that have suffered the most, and their apparent weakness may be linked to the condition rather than to their being painted by Benedetto or another assistant. The orange, which is orpiment and realgar, and the once blue, which is smalt, have deteriorated quite badly, and so the effect of that drapery and the damage in some of the other draperies to some degree may account for the weakness. In 1667, after hanging in the chapel for which they were conceived for almost 100 years, the 5 canvases by Veronese, which he had painted for degli Arbori, left the chapel of St. Jerome in Murano. On August 1st of that year, Candida Valier, presumably one of the 2 nuns who acted as executors of Francesco degli Arbori's will at that point, signed a document about the paintings in the chapel. In it, she describes Veronese's 2 canvases, one above the altar and one over the door, in the small chapel, and states that experts determined that the canvases were suffering damage from the injuries of time inside the said chapel. For this reason, the paintings were moved, together with the 3 quadretti of the Pietà, St. Nicholas and St. John the Baptist, to the main church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, and replaced in the chapel with copies. And incidentally, the fantastic frames, which were also restored for the exhibition, are late 17th century and probably date to the time when the paintings were removed to the main church of Santa Maria degli Angeli. While Candida Valier claimed that the paintings had been removed from their original location for conservation reasons, Boschini added a further reason. The St. Jerome is such a beautiful thing that people are taken by its beauty and keep trying to steal it, and for this reason it was moved to the main church. No doubt, a combination of these factors led the nuns to move the paintings inside the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli. From the second half of the 17th century to the early 19th century, authors and guidebooks and biographers of Veronese cited the 5 canvases as being inside the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli in the nave. In the early 19th century, with the fall of the Venetian Republic and the Napoleonic invasion of Italy, there was a widespread suppression of most religious institutions. In the late spring and summer of 1810, most monasteries and convents in Venice were closed, and that was also the fate of the nuns' monastery at Santa Maria degli Angeli, which was officially closed in July of that year. The chapel of Francesco degli Arbori was subsequently used as storage for the Scuola dei Barcaroli, a lay organization for gondoliers for the traghetti of Murano, who in 1806 had moved their headquarters from the Church of San Cristoforo to Santa Maria degli Angeli. Unrecorded after 1810, the Pietà, St. Nicholas and St. John the Baptist are now lost and must have left the church around that time. By 1815, the St. Jerome in the Wilderness and the St. Agatha Visited and imprisoned by St. Peter had been moved to another neighboring Dominican church, San Pietro Martire. Both the nuns' monastery and the chapel of St. Jerome were demolished in 1830. Fortunately, the church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, even if heavily reworked in its interior, was spared and survived. Veronese's 2 paintings have been on display for the past 200 years in San Pietro Martire, on the wall of the left nave. Hanging in San Pietro Martire, Veronese's 2 paintings for Francesco degli Arbori's small chapel in Murano have almost been forgotten by scholars. The St. Jerome was exhibited outside the church only once, in 1939, at the monographic exhibition on Veronese at the Ca' Giustinian. The canvas has appeared in all subsequent studies on the artist, but without any thorough analysis of its patron or original location. Somewhat in limbo between Paolo and Benedetto Cagliari, the St. Agatha Visited and imprisoned by St. Peter has been even less studied. The recent restoration of both canvases, supervised by Venetian Heritage and sponsored by Bulgari, as well as the technical analysis that accompanied their treatment, will allow future generations to better understand these masterpieces by Veronese. I would here like to thank both Venetian Heritage and Bulgari for their support of this project. But in particular, I would like to thank the restorer, Claudia Vittori, who has worked tirelessly on the paintings and brought them back to their original glory. and I had many meetings with her in the studio, having a lot of fun looking at these pictures while she was working on them. Dr. Vittori is here tonight and would be happy to answer questions about her work on the canvases after the lecture in the exhibition. The chapel built for Francesco degli Arbori was an exceptional structure for the Venetian Lagoon, and the history and personalities of this priest warrant a better understanding. And what I've tried to do in the exhibition is to give a feeling of what this chapel may have looked like in the Oval Room, arguably a much bigger space than where they were in originally, probably. The reasons for this prestigious commission still remain shrouded in the fog of the past. But for Murano, Veronese created two compositions outstanding for their originality and painterly skill. The destruction of the chapel has meant the loss to subsequent generations of a fascinating site for Veronese's work in the 1560s. It is noteworthy that in these years, Veronese was not only a painter of magnificent and massive feasts for monastic refectories, of monumental altarpieces for the most prominent churches in and out of Venice, and of grandiose allegories for the aristocracy and the ruling families of Europe, but he also dedicated some of his time to producing a cycle of canvases for a simple priest in Murano. The island has retained its enchanting character, and the small monastic cemetery of Santa Maria degli Angeli can still be seen in its original size in a forsaken northwest corner of Murano. After the 2017-2018 exhibition on the paintings, first in Venice at the Galleria dell'Accademia, now here in New York at the Frick Collection, and next at the New Orleans Museum of Art, the two paintings that once decorated this lost structure will return to the church where they had been preserved for the past 200 years. Francesco degli Arbori's construction of a chapel and its decoration constitute a fascinating episode in the history of art of Murano. Unrecognized and discarded, degli Arbori's body is presumably still lying somewhere in the little cemetery. But new attention to the two spectacular canvases that he commissioned allows us to remember him and tell the story of an ambitious priest who, thanks to his devotion, gave us two masterpieces by one of the most important painters of the 16th century. And for this, I think we should be very thankful. Thank you.